online saying that I'm going to talk about, rather than phasing in new technology, talk about phasing out existing infrastructure. And I'm looking at the gas grid as an example here. And I will explain why that is important. And in my talk, I'm going to draw on three reports primarily, which you can see on this slide here. On the left-hand side, this is a recent paper that I've written with some colleagues. And we've looked at the role of regulation. How can regulation accommodate a decline in gas use and manage the gas grid through adapting the way how we regulate gas companies. The report in the middle we just published a couple of weeks ago, and that is looking how different countries in Europe actually deal with the challenge of falling gas demand and how they already practically adapt their regulation. And then on the very right-hand side, what you see here is a report we've published a while back, actually, it was 2 years ago or so, looking at some of the principles that should, in our view, underpin regulatory changes, things like equity, for example, how to make that fair, but also integrated planning with things that go on in electricity. So I'm going to draw on those three reports amongst other material, but that's informed much of my thinking about this subject. And I have 5 parts to my talk that I quickly run you through. Very briefly talk about the existing gas grid, what that looks like, to give you a flavor of how big that infrastructure actually is. I then want to go into demand projections for gas demand at international, European, and national level. Then talk about decommissioning a bit, because that is probably one of the aspects that people are very interested in, and that's why you joined this talk. And there are some examples actually where this is already happening, and so I'm going to draw on that a little bit. Then talk about the challenges in the fourth part of my talk, what this means for consumers. And who actually pays for this? What happens if we don't do anything? And then fifth is going to draw heavily on my first paper. What's the way out of this? Because there's a huge challenge that we have in front of us, and we'll talk a bit about how to solve it with regulation and then wrap up. So that's the plan for the talk. Let's start with number 1, which is the gas grids today. And I know some of you have seen these slides before in an amended fashion. Apologies for some of the cross-posting and duplication, but I think they're useful for those who haven't seen them before. So currently the transmission grid in Europe, and this includes the UK, has a length of, roughly speaking, 3 times the circumference of the Earth. So that's what we've built over the last decades. It's a vast grid to transport gas over long distances in large quantities. The main gas grid, though, is on the distribution side. When you look at the gas distribution side, it's closer to 45 times the circumference of the Earth. That's, again, across Europe. If you did that globally, it would be a much bigger number. I want to talk about Europe primarily in my talk today. So it's a vast infrastructure, and this gas grid is very finely meshed in some countries. I mean, we're in Oxford here today. Oxford, pretty much all of the buildings, with some exceptions, some people like myself have switched to heat pumps. There might be some buildings that have a communal heating system network, but most buildings will be connected up to the gas grid, the vast majority of buildings. Look at the Netherlands, 95% plus of buildings are connected to the gas grid. In other countries, it's less prevalent. But overall, it's fair to say that the gas grid is very, very important currently for heating buildings, in Europe in particular, and in many countries provides the majority of buildings with a heat source. So it's a very important critical infrastructure, and that is also why it's important to talk about it in the context of what happens if we transition. Second part of my presentation is a little bit longer, and it's looking at demand projections. And I'm going to start with looking at the IEA's projections in a minute. But first of all, I wanted to address one topic head on, and that is the role of hydrogen and it could play to just replace the gas. Because some people online, but also in the audience, might say, well, the whole framing is already wrong. We will just replace the gas in the pipes with other gases, with so-called alternative gases, hydrogen or biomethane. And I've done a review, 2 reviews actually, of all the independent studies out there, meta review published about a year ago in December, and there was one published a year before, and there's now 54 studies independently funded, not by industry interests, and they all come to the same conclusion that there is, if any, a very limited role for hydrogen in heating. Yeah, it might play a role in some hybrid systems in very cold climates, waste heat from electrolyzers in district heating, maybe some peaking plants in district heating, but not at scale. And you can see some of the institutions here that are listed that have authored these reports. There are many more, but I just given you a bit of a snapshot. And when you look at the distribution of modeling and where hydrogen sits in the heating sector, it's about 1% is the median. You see here of the different studies, and 1% is the median of all of the studies that have quantified the contribution of hydrogen to heating, to the building sector. So very, very low. So it's unlikely that hydrogen will replace the gas in the pipes, and therefore my main question, what do we do with the gas grid with gas in decline, still stands. And biomethane, you may say, could play a role. Well, if you look at the national scenarios, for example, for Germany, even if the most ambitious pathways for biomethane get realized, by 2030, maybe 3% or so of all of the gas used in buildings alone could be replaced with biomethane. And Germany is a very large producer of biomethane because of the past policies. So it's unlikely that we're going to replace a significant chunk of gas, of fossil gas, with biomethane as well. That's why the projections from the organizations such as the IEA, International Energy Agency, look like this. So this is global, and it includes energy service increase, right? There are some countries where more energy will be used in the IEA scenario, simply because they currently use, they're not satisfying their needs, right? They might not be using the same amount of energy that they actually require to meet the same standard of living. But what you see is that the total gas demand, this is all gases, that's the top line here, all gases, fuels, biomethane, hydrogen, and fossil gas together, you see a significant decline. When you look at fossil gas, that's the red line here, a much steeper decline as you would expect. And then you see biomethane and hydrogen ramping up, not insignificantly, but certainly not making up for that big shortfall in the fossil gas line. That's the IEA's Net Zero 2050 roadmap. How does this look in Europe? It actually looks quite similar, but it's more aggressive in terms of how quickly the European Commission believes gas demand will fall. Here are 4 scenarios modeled in the recent 2040 climate target impact assessment released in February of this year. And what you find is that, again, for all gases put together, this includes biomethane, hydrogen, any other synthetic gases, and fossil gas, the decline is very significant, about 70% or so over the next 2.5 decades. National level data for the UK, again, not so dissimilar. Here's the sort of forecast. It's basically scenario modeling from the National Grid ESO, the energy system operator, now called NESO, the National Energy System Operator, future energy scenarios. I'm sure many of you will have seen those. And in all but one of the scenarios, do you see a very steep decline in the use of gas in the UK? What is the exception here? The red line, the falling short scenario. Well, that is an assumption that the rollout of heat pumps and district heating stalls, doesn't happen, and hydrogen is a fallback option in that scenario. The other 3 scenarios, which are preferable according to the Committee on Climate Change because they deliver the same outcome at lower costs, all show a very significant reduction in gas demand. There's a problem here, though. This is what the scenarios tell us, right? When you look at gas grid operators and what they project in what they tell the regulator is quite a different story. I'm going to zoom in a minute. But what we've done in the report, remember the 3 reports, the one in the middle, we've actually looked at a selection of countries and looked at what the gas grid operators project and put to the regulator as their future forecast, which is then in turn used to inform regulatory decisions as to how much money can be spent on the gas grid. There's a big mismatch in most countries we've looked at. In other words, what the climate scenarios tell us needs to be done in terms of gas use decline is not matched by what the gas grid operators anticipate. And why is that? Well, in some cases, these forecasts are simply based on the status quo. So it's a projection of existing trends. or surveys. So they will ask customers, the selection of customers, how much gas do you think you're going to need in the future? And that's why we see this discrepancy, because of course, neither of the two approaches takes into account the necessity of reducing gas and burning fossil fuels. So let's zoom in a little bit and just look at some of these examples. Take Germany, top left corner. This is probably one of the places where the discrepancy is the largest. So the green space, that is the range of gas demands that the climate scenarios that have been modeled for Germany suggest would be following a net zero pathway. The red line is what the gas grid operators assume will be needed. And you can see the difference. One goes up, one goes down, and there's a big gap between them, essentially. You see the same being the case in other countries. The Netherlands, less stark perhaps, or Austria. The UK is a bit of an exception because actually the scenarios are not completely aligned. That might change with the next report by the Committee on Climate Change next year, remains to be seen. But the UK is a bit of an exception here. When you look at Italy and Belgium, same story. So in all of these countries, which are big, intensive, heavy gas users, you see this discrepancy. And of course, that raises some important question for the regulator and for policymakers. And I want to talk a bit about gas grid decommissioning and what we're already seeing. So in different places around Europe, the discussion about the gas grid has now actually got a lot of public attention. Not so much in the UK yet, but I'm going to just give you a sort of sense of what's going on. You don't see any gas grid decommissioning in the data yet. So we don't see gas grids being decommissioned at all when you look at the high-level data. Here's data for Germany. It's actually quite hard to find. It's quite hard to find granular data where it's tracked year by year at a granular level. But for Germany, we found this data. And what we found is actually that the development of both the gas distribution and transmission networks, you don't really see a shrinkage yet. There's no indication. And in fact, when you look at the investment put into the gas grid infrastructure, it has not gone down until recently. That is starting to change, but in the high-level data, we're not seeing a shrinkage of the gas grid yet. However, you might have seen these news. This is the city of Mannheim. It's a city of, I think, about 300,000 people. So a sizable city in Germany. Ludwigshafen, where BASF is headquartered, is just opposite on the other side of the river. And in Mannheim, the Stadtwerke, which is the energy company that is owned by the municipality, announced just, I think 3 weeks ago it was, that by 2035, they're going to shut down the entire gas network in the city. That made big headlines, mostly in Germany, but also outside of Germany. And there are other examples like this. Here's Augsburg. This is a little bit earlier this year. The city of Augsburg, a bit smaller than Mannheim, made similar statements that they're going to decommission parts, not all of it, but parts of the gas network. Switzerland, same story here. This is the city of Basel, and they announced that by 2037, they're going to sort of take steps towards decommission the gas grid. And there are many other examples. Winterthur is a city near Zurich, and there's more examples from Vienna, for example, but also Hamburg, Hanover. There's more and more cities now looking at that. Why is that? Well, in Germany, there's a very specific reason. There's a law that requires all local authorities to deliver what is called communal heat planning. So they are required by law to draw up plans, how they're going to decarbonize the heating. And as a result, we see some of these cities now coming out with these plans and saying very clearly that there is no space for the continuation of the use of the gas grid, and that's why they make these big announcements. The question, of course, is what does all of this mean, and how will it affect consumers, right? And is there a cost to this, and who will pay for it? And that's the next part of my presentation, which is the impact on gas grid fees. And this is something that is a topic that is so far really overlooked, and I think it's very important. I sometimes hear people on both sides of the debate tell me, oh, don't do anything, it's fine. The environmentalists might say it's good if gas grid fees go up because more people will leave the gas grid, and that means we have a faster switch away from gas. And then people who actually want to see a continuation of the gas grid might say, well, let's wait and see if people really switch, and if they switch, we can still make adjustments later on, but let's do nothing for now. I think they're both wrong, and I will explain sort of why that is in the next few minutes. Here's some projections for different countries across Europe. What would happen to gas grid fees if some of these scenarios that I shown you earlier will be followed through and we do nothing? We don't touch regulation, we do nothing and just let things play out. And you see here in some cases, the UK, for example, 10 times higher fees for the gas grid. I can try to translate that to make it a little bit, because you might not know what is a 4 euro cent per kilowatt hour gas grid fee. How does this compare? I think the current price cap for gas in the UK is something like 6 pence per kilowatt hour, i.e. something like 7 euro cents per kilowatt hour. If currently the gas grid fee is a small part of that, right? We're talking about half, maybe a euro cent per kilowatt hour. But that will go up to 5. So in other words, a significant chunk, maybe 40% or so of your gas bill will suddenly be for the gas grid fee rather than the fuel that you consume. And that will increase prices quite substantially. And of course, this is something that is already happening in some places. So here's France. Actually, not long ago, it was just this year, we have seen the president of the French energy regulator, CRE, actually saying gas grid fees are going up now. And one of the reasons for that is because there's fewer people who actually are hooked up to the gas grid. Why is that? Well, France, you might have seen that in the news too, has been very successful in rolling out heat pumps. Actually, more than half of the French heating system market is now heat pumps. And that means every year, a significant chunk of people effectively defects the gas grid. And that is driving, at least in part, what's going on in France with gas grid fees and bills. And it's something we have actually highlighted already way before anyone really talked about it. This is my colleague Louise Sunderland, who was presented, I think, here a while back on flexibility and equity. And she's written a piece, this is actually going back to 2020, highlighting the challenge of what happens if we decarbonize heating. And what happens with those customers who are on the gas grid and rely on it for heating, but may not be able to switch away from it. I mean, this is a great topic, I think, for future research, because often you find that those people who switch last might be tenants, might be people with no access to capital. And if they then end up paying those really high gas grid fees, I mean, I would say that's a moral problem, and there's an equity issue. There's also a huge political issue, because if we don't get on top of this, it's very hard to see how you can actually follow through with these kinds of plans. And I believe we need a managed transition to allow people to plan for it and also to share the costs much more fairly. And I will come back to what this will look like in a minute. And we see also, this is very recent, this is in Germany just a few weeks ago, we've seen the cost for the gas grid in Germany now also rising. Grid fees are going up, partly because there is something going on that is called accelerated depreciation, which is one of the key tools that we have at our disposal to actually share the costs more fairly. And I'm going to talk about that in the last and final part of my presentation now, which is what is the way out? Because I've kind of shown you sort of what the challenge would be. We have a big gas grid. We have falling gas demand in pretty much all of the scenarios that meet net zero. We forecast a rising gas grid fees. So what do we do, right? That's the question. That's drawing heavily on the academic paper, the first one on the left-hand side I've shown you on my first slide. And I distill this in one simple graphic here. How do we deal with it? I walk you through these 5 steps. So the first one is integrated planning. One of the problems currently is that regulators typically, it's not the case for every single regulator, but typically treat gas, electricity, and district heat as very separate areas of regulation. And there's not a lot of cross-fertilization and integration between those regulations happening. Which is a problem, because if you don't know what's going to happen with your gas grid, then you can't really plan how much electrification is required, anticipate investments on that side, And the same is the case for district heating. If you don't know whether district heating is going to come, well, you may as well continue maintaining and upgrading the gas grid. So that is really important to have integrated planning. And in fact, that is one of the #1 reasons why we now have NESO in the UK, the National Energy System Operator. When you look at the justification the government gave for why they've done that, it is very much to bring together the different vectors of regulation to make sure that integration takes place. The second step, setting appropriate depreciation rates. That's essentially about accelerated depreciation. So gas grid infrastructure might have lifetimes of 80, 90 years. Typically, again, I use the UK here as an example, but it's very similar in other countries where we looked at. Typically, the depreciation times would be maybe 40, 50 years. In other words, you'll be paying back the investors over a period of 40 to 50 years. And you do that by baking these costs into rates, into the fees that people pay for the gas grid, right? But if we want to decommission parts of the gas grid because of falling gas demand already by 2050, that's in 26 years. So having a 45 or 50-year depreciation period doesn't match, doesn't really work. In other words, what it means is that in 2050, there's still a lot of money that needs to be paid back. Who's going to pay that money? So one of the solutions is we actually bring that forward and pay off the gas grid infrastructure early on and start today, because we now have a lot of people still on the gas grid. We can share the costs, and the longer we wait, the more difficult it will get. This may sound academic, but it's already happening. So in Germany, I mentioned that before, there's now a new regulation that does exactly that. It allows the gas grid companies to depreciate their assets earlier. And the same is the case in the Netherlands, where we typically look at depreciation rates of maybe just 20 years. In the UK, just recently, the regulator decided that for new gas grid infrastructure, this can be done, and they consider it also for existing. So this is a key way of dealing with that problem of compounding costs for a shrinking number of consumers in later years. The third step, I think if we talk about decommissioning, and I'm not saying we decommission the entire gas grid, right? That's not what I'm saying. But clearly, with the numbers we've seen, if we have 70%, 80% less gas use, there will be areas where gas grids are no longer feasible, no longer tenable, either because of engineering reasons. If you don't have enough gas throughput, I'm not an engineer, gas grid engineer, but I understand there's a limit. You need to have a certain utilization rate, otherwise you can't actually technically use the gas grid for that. But also economically, it just makes no sense if you have only a handful of households still being hooked up to the gas grid. So defining criteria and setting thresholds that allows the regulator to actually tell the gas grid operators, this area will no longer be served, or cities, if they have the powers to make those decisions. And that could, I have a few examples here. You could define that in megawatt hours transported per kilometer, or in the US, it would be BTU. So you have some throughput, or it could be the density, how many people actually hooked up to the gas grid in a certain area, or a combination. But some sort of criteria that is objective and is consistent and can be used in regulation will be needed. Fourth step, minimizing capital investment. Some of you might have seen that we still see a lot of construction work in the UK. Roads are being opened up because there's something going on. It's called the Iron Mains Replacement Program in the UK, which was primarily being introduced for safety reasons, because some of the old pipes are leaky and there's risks of explosions, etc., etc. So we have replaced some of the old metal pipes with plastic pipes, essentially, and that's still going on at a not insignificant cost. We also have programs that actually convert electrically heated households to the gas grid, and that's happening under fuel poverty programs in the UK. So that is new capital investment. Everybody pays for it who is connected to the gas grid. When my view, or the view of my co-authors as well, is that we should minimize that capital investment. I'm not saying it's zero, because there's going to be some need for maintenance. There's going to be some need for upgrades, because we're not going to shut down the entire gas grid tomorrow. But making sure that any new investment is carefully evaluated, because if we don't do that, we then again add more capital that needs to be depreciated to the pile and make the problem bigger and make it harder to resolve it. And then finally, this is the fifth step here, decommissioning and disconnections are not free, right? Sometimes people say, oh, just leave the gas grid in the ground and we can walk away from it. We can't. There's actually cost to make it safe, and it's not small. It's not a small cost to make it safe. And also disconnections cost money. We have to disconnect all of the buildings that are currently connected to the gas grid if they switch away from gas. And in many countries, there's still a big hurdle because customers then face this cost. In some places, that cost can be exceeding thousands of pounds, of euros. And of course, if we also then want to persuade people to adopt other technologies, heat pumps or connected district heating, well, if we charge them to do that, really doesn't work, does it? If we, on the other hand, then have subsidy programs that encourage them to do it. So these kinds of costs, I believe, should be socialized. There should be a decommissioning and disconnection fund. And again, this is not academic. We see countries doing that. So in Denmark, for example, there is no cost for those disconnecting from the gas grid. And I think in the Netherlands, there's also a fund for decommissioning. So there can be money set aside for these sorts of things. An add-on to this is heat planning. I just quickly want to bring this in because this is, again, a topic that is overlooked, super important. In Denmark, has been done since 1979. This is the year when I was born. It's called the Heat Supply Act, which requires all local authorities to look at heat planning. And that's why Denmark has 70% or so of buildings connected to district heating. It goes back to that Heat Supply Act and to heat planning. And in the EU Energy Efficiency Directive, which is not, of course, applicable to the UK, there's a requirement now to do mandatory heat planning in towns with more than 45,000 people. So it would apply to Oxford. The UK is moving to heat zoning, which is less stringent, I might argue. Yeah, it's sort of more looking at where do different technologies make sense. It's a good first step. But it doesn't have any immediate consequences. The immediate consequence in other countries is sometimes that actually these plans are mandatory, they're binding. And if you live in an area that is designated for gas grid decommissioning, you can't install another gas boiler. If the district heating network is coming, there might be a requirement to connect to it. And it will require a lot of new powers potentially for local authorities, capacity building. I mean, I'd actually talked to quite a few people in Oxford how difficult it is to understand what the options are, what the solutions are in a complex city like Oxford. And Oxford has a lot of smart people in the council, in the university. There are lots of great companies that actually are active in Oxford. But this is not the case in all cities. And there's a real requirement, I think, to upskill people who work in cities to understand this really rather complex topic. So heat planning is critical. How am I doing for time? All right. I just wanted to give you a snapshot before I wrap up of what's going on in different countries around Europe, some of the positive things that we have observed. I'm not going to dwell on some of the barriers we're seeing. And this is on this rather busy slide here. Already walked through some of the things in the UK. I talked about heat zoning and accelerated depreciation for new gas grid investments. I talked about Denmark a little bit here as well. Just to highlight something for Denmark, which is probably the most ambitious. By 2030, Denmark has agreed, the Danish government has agreed, that no more gas will be used in buildings for heating. I don't think a lot of people know that, but that's in 6 years, right, from today. No more gas used in buildings in Denmark, which is quite dramatic because there's still quite a few people who use gas, and even in Denmark with that high penetration of district heating. In Germany, we will see, I think, unless we have a change in government very soon, they will change it all again. But if the current legal framework persists, all major cities and then also smaller cities will be required to provide heat plants which are aligned with net zero and with the climate goals, and they are mandatory. They then trigger the heating law, which makes it illegal to install certain types of heating systems, which is a big step. Remains to be seen whether or not that is still in place after the next election. But there are potentially some very significant changes happening there. And maybe just to pick up on the Netherlands here as well, which is probably the country, Chris.
I thought that the ban on newly installed gas boilers had been rolled back in Germany. That
on gas boilers in new buildings,
yeah.
Or
no, in any form of new.
It has been rolled back. It's right. Been tied to what is called communal heat planning. I think the people online, you probably couldn't hear this. Chris Goller asked a question about the heating law in Germany, which was much tougher until last year when it was renegotiated and went through Parliament. It required actually by the 1st of January that you could no longer install a heating system unless it ran on 65% renewables. That was the proposal, but it was significantly changed and altered, and is now actually depends on communal heat planning. So that has to come first, and then the regulations are triggered essentially once communal heating plans are in place. I think I stop here in terms of Germany, but very quickly on the Netherlands. What's interesting in the Netherlands is that there has been a long experience now, a few years of actually doing extensive local consultations and bringing in people trying to work out what the best solutions are. There's a lot that could be learned from the Netherlands and from the Dutch approach. Regulation there has been amended as well, in terms of the acceleration of depreciation and how easy it is to disconnect from the gas grid in the Netherlands. There's a lot more detail in our report, but certainly I would say the top countries that we can look at that we've identified here: Denmark, the Netherlands, are probably the leading countries, and then there's a few others where there's bits that are particularly interesting and worth exploring. Let me wrap up. So first of all, it's an under-researched topic. There's not many papers on it. When you go to Google Scholar or Scopus and you type in gas grid decommissioning, net zero, or whatever words you put in there aren't that many papers. There's some, but it's quite limited. And I mean, partly it is probably because, and coming back to my introduction, because this is not about sexy new technology that we're ramping up, and it's about actually thinking about what we already have, what we're going to do with that. It's complex because it's not just let's just shut down the gas grid and move to renewables. This is critical infrastructure, and lots of people depend on it. And at the same time, we have to build out infrastructure that will replace it, and it's a complex process and requires a lot of analysis that is energy systems wide. Which is why there's a critical role for regulators to potentially have a net zero mandate, for example, and be required to have integrated planning rather than treat gas grid regulation in isolation. And we're moving towards that now in some countries. And the UK is actually one of them, which is good to see. I think there's a lack of understanding among stakeholders. There's a lot of uncertainty still. People don't really know what to do with this topic. Of course, the gas networks, they're on top of this because this is their core business model. But I don't think local authorities, consumer groups, environmental groups have fully understood how important this topic is. And this could also derail, I think, a lot of the progress we've seen, because if you don't do anything, and if your gas grid fees go through the roof, the politics of that are going to be quite difficult. And it's important, I think, to also make sure that investors are reassured and continue to invest in the technologies we want them to invest in. So a disorderly exit from the gas grid is in nobody's interests, I believe. It's not in the interest of the gas grid companies, of investors, of consumers, of people who work on net zero. I think it's essential. But the policy landscape is moving very, very fast. These targets kick in some cases already in 20 years. We have to, like the German net zero target is 2045, right? We're going to decarbonize the UK's electricity sector if the government is succeeding by 2030. So these things are happening at breakneck speed. At the same time, we're dealing with infrastructure that has developed over many, many decades. So this requires, I think, a lot more people who can think about solutions and see what's happening in different places in the world, learn from them, and then hopefully with that, we can inform a better, more long-term approach when it comes to gas grid regulation. Thank you very much. I think I left some time for questions and comments, and I'm sure you have many, and I'm sure there's things that you disagree with or want to challenge me on, and I'll be very happy to be challenged. So don't hold back.
Thank you, Jan. As I said in the beginning, Jan has a bit of an eye for things that might be lying ahead and are worth paying attention to. With your track record in that, I think we're probably all well advised to keep an eye on the gas grid. I can see hands going up already, so we're going to have a good debate as you projected. One thing I was wondering is the beauty with networks is when you build them out, you get these economies of scale, sort of positive reinforcement because go down, more and more people want to be part of the network. When you reverse that, you might get these negative feedbacks, and you showed how prices go up, which might drive even more people off the grid. Might there be sort of some accelerating downward spiral that we're sort of launching into, and that might suddenly become much, much quicker than we anticipate?
I think that is the risk, right? And I mean, there are different, there are some very radical solutions. So in Denmark, actually the Ministry of Finance owns the gas grid. They bought the gas grid. So they shield consumers from those risks. I mean, that's, you can't really see that happening in a lot of other countries where the gas grid is also quite a small gas grid in Denmark, to be fair. But that's one of the radical solutions that could shield consumers. But yes, indeed, I mean, it's only the last few years, right? When you look at the slide that I've shown you, it only happens in the last few years that these fees really get out of control. It's like an negative exponential curve, if you will, with people defecting the gas grid and then fees going up. And I think that is a risk indeed, and managing that is very important. I think we need anticipatory investment regulation to deal with that.
Yeah, and I've seen